So hi everyone, welcome to a new video. Today we have with us this passage which is The Subtle Art of Elevation, and it is written by Carl Kinsella. Years ago, my professor would make his architectural students or history students prepare for seminars by pinning large sheets of paper to a notice board. Each had finely printed plans and elevations on them. Over the week, I'd stand in front of those sheets for at least an hour, looking at the various drawings as instructed. Back in class, students took turns to explain what exactly the drawings represented or depicted, determining the building's appearance from the drawings alone, and describing how a person might move through the space, as if we were there. Those well spent hours were among my favorite during my degree. The language of drawing was a catalyst to my imagination, creating worlds beyond what words could ever do. So the author is trying to appreciate how her professor used to teach his students, and also she used to like the technique her professor used to teach with. In learning about this language, I realized that we know remarkably little about how it developed, as if arose fully formed in the 13th century, since no single drawing can be linked to a specific building until that century's end. This baffled me, or this surprised the author, and that there is very little evidence present in according to the history. How could monuments like Durham Cathedral, the renovated Basilica of Saint Denis outside Paris, and all the high Gothic churches in the northern Europe have been made without something so simple as drawing? So the author is trying to continue her idea that she is very surprised about the fact. Uh, Visually communicating the appearance of a building seems a natural thing to do. So the author thinks that it is very natural for us to plan before building something, an easier way of planning. As it happens, drawings were the author is trying to appreciate the power of drawing of architectural landscape or architectural things, objects. As it happens, drawings were used in construction process before 13th century. In the first century BCE, so the author is trying to give an example that drawings were used before 13th century also. The architect Vitruvius wrote in his De Architectura in an attempt to elevate the practice of architecture to the level of liberal arts, that is, work derived from the mind rather than the mindless graft of one's hands. Okay, so the author is saying that in the first century BCE, Vitruvius actually tried to depict an architecture with the help of paintings or drawings. Okay. Near the beginning of the treatise, Vitruvius describes three types of architectural drawings. So there are three types. One is plans, the second one is elevations, and the third one is very likely to be drawings in perspective. Despite this evidence for the use of drawings, none survive from antiquity. So there is very little evidence that which actually proves what the author is saying. The only examples to weather the test of time are monumental plans inscribed on stone or mosaics, but these could have been decorative objects, simple maps or sculptural monuments. So these are not architectural drawings; these are specifically something else or decorative things. Their purpose is not clear. Also, most were done after buildings they depict were completed. So these were definitely not the part of the planning. So they cannot have been used in the construction process. After the decline of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, the infrastructure for educating and training architects vanished in the West. Okay. So after the Roman decline of the Roman Empire, the architectural planning diminished or declined. Not until the 13th century we do get a designer who oversees several projects simultaneously, a sort of proto-architect. Prior to their emergence, there was a master mason who would make certain geometrical constructions on the ground or in plaster. Okay, so there was some person allowing him to construct the layout of a building. So he or she did some architectural drawings. That's what the author is saying. After the 5th century in Rome. This master mason is an obscure historical figure. So obscure refers to not clear. Okay. He likely did not have a formal education but started his career as an apprentice who learned. So he started his career likely as an intern who learned structurally sound forms from his master. Okay. So he learned from his or her master or his master. He would have traveled across building sites, learning and picking up new design and ideas. Okay, so he learned. At 12th century Canterbury, for example, the original designer of the Gothic building as William of Sens who likely had experience of working on the new Gothic elements of the French cathedral. He could promise that and more to his new patrons in England, and not necessarily using a drawing, but describing what he would do in the coming years. So there were evidences regarding architectural planning, but not exactly drawing, except some of them, like this master mason used drawing on ground, which was not very evident, because drawing on ground is not a very permanent way of drawing something or explaining something. And also there was, I guess, William of Sense, who actually communicated his idea of planning through voice. So nothing was actually there with respect to drawing, architectural drawing. Later in the 15th century, the artist and architect Leon Battista Alberti, in his brief mention of architectural drawings, assumes that they are done only by architects. This leaves us with a story of architecture that follows a well-worn narrative. The decline of Rome led to the dearth of advanced practices, which were picked up again only in the early modern Italy. But this is not the real story. So there is a story regarding the fact that after the decline of Rome, means no scientific discovery regarding architecture was done yet. But it is not entirely true. That's what the author is suggesting. So let's continue reading. Towards the middle of the 12th century, a Scottish theologian named Richard moved across the Channel or the English Channel, I guess so, to Paris and to the Abbey of Saint Victor on the left bank. Okay, about a 20-minute walk from where Notre Dame Cathedral stands today. But so the author is giving a geographical description of the place. But outside the walls of the medieval city, here Richard penned a commentary on the book of Ezekiel, filled with more than dozen plans and elevations that systematically represent the buildings the prophet describes. These are key to understanding the beginning of architectural drawing in the West. Okay, so this is the source or the um, inception of architectural drawing. Richard is the first person to use the term plan with reference to a drawing that would be recognized as a plan today. He was the first person we know of to represent a building more than once, offering a three-dimensional view of the structure, and the first to provide a clear sectional elevation, where part of the building is sliced through or giving a cross section to give a view of the interior. His commentary suggests that architectural drawings were in use full century earlier than is conventionally held. So it was present previously also, complete with a fully fleshed language for the representation of 3D objects. So there was a person who is named Richard, who told that architectural drawings are important and they were present before he started explaining them. The Abbey of St. Victor was established in 1108 at the beginning of what the historian Charles Homer Haskins in 1927 called the 12th century Renaissance. The Renaissance was characterized by a renewed focus on the classical literature and a drive to understand on a drive to understand the physical world. Okay, so the Renaissance was actually driven by the focus on literature and the physical world. Okay, Latin translations of ancient Greek and Arabic works on mathematics, geometry, and every other subject gave energy to scholars to interrogate the world a little deeper. Okay, so there was some research going on. Works by Aristotle, Euclid, and Plato, dimly known but whose writing was thought gone forever, began to arrive on the shores of Europe. So there was some research regarding the works of Aristotle, Euclid, and Plato also. Within this swirling intellectual storm, the members of Saint Victor had one of the best libraries in Europe and a commitment to teach whoever wanted to learn. Okay, so they were committed to a learning and researching on things. They were spiritual centrists, never veering close to zealotry and never losing their minds to the new fashion for pure logic, so they didn't deviate too much. Characterized by the infamous self promoter Peter Abelard. So there was a person named Peter Abelard and he was into this movement. With the fine resources and stimulation that Saint Victor provided, Richard began his commentary on the book of Ezekiel, a daunting or challenging task for anyone who has read it. Ezekiel prophesied during the Israelites' exile in Babylon where the once captive Jews remained in the centuries following the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. So he was there during that time. It is a book of consolation and of hope, especially the last section, which contains a detailed architectural description of a new temple that would descend from the heavens onto the mountain when the Israelites returned to their homeland. Ezekiel describes meeting a man with brazen complexion holding a measuring stick who accompanies the prophet around the buildings while measuring every detail. At the first glance, the buildings Ezekiel describes and their arrangement seems straightforward. Okay, so at the first glance, they were straightforward. There are three courtyards of diminishing size set into one another, and each section is accessed via an elaborate gateway. The new temple at the center of everything is perched on the mountain's plateau. Out front, in the smallest courtyard, there is an altar for sacrifices where the temple contains three spaces: a vestibule, a long narrow hall. A vestibule is a long narrow hall, and a smaller room called the Holy of Holies. Okay, so the author is giving a description of what the book of Ezekiel describes a temple to be at Babylon. But the details are impossible to follow. For example, the description of the gateways range over different chapters, and though Ezekiel specified their parts, the measurements do not always make sense. So the measurements were not consistent at all. We are told the breadth of the building is 1 reed or 6 cubits um, or some length, that the threshold to the gate is 6 cubits and the porch of the gate is 8 cubits. As the description continues, it is tempting to pick up a pen and draw alongside its reading, the better to follow, but the layout is difficult to grasp. Okay, so the layout is difficult to draw on a paper. In the 6th century, the Pope Gregory I concluded that it was impossible to understand the architecture in a literal way, and that the lack of sense within Ezekiel's words was a sure sign that they could only be allegorical or metaphorical in nature. Gregory gave the example of a door described as wider than the wall to which it is attached. So it is impossible. Door cannot be larger than the wall where it is there. For Richard, brought up on an intellectual diet defined by the rigors of St. Victor's School, it was important to understand the facts of Ezekiel's words. He needed to know exactly what the prophet saw. And so, Richard's commentary on this part of the book of Ezekiel included more than dozen planes and elevations to help realize the prophet's vision. Okay, so Richard tried to envision what the prophet thought. Telling his readers why he included the drawings, Richard says he wanted to show that no matter how simple they might be, the truth of his argument was that these buildings had a tangible or a realistic existence, and that Ezekiel's description makes sense if the reader has the wit to follow it. So, Ezekiel's description has real sense if one has the intellectual capability or competency to follow it or to understand it. Richard's drawings are like nothing made before. They are precocious in pointing to a masterful visualization of space long before the language of architectural drawing was systematized. Richard used recent developments in geometry to fully articulate the relationship between the plans and elevations. In fact, the drawings represent the beginning of architectural abstraction in the West, not because he uses plans and elevations, but because he uses them together to give readers a real sense of buildings in 3 dimensions. So, Richard used these techniques to depict or to demonstrate a three-dimensional object into a two-dimensional plane. As far as we know, no one in Europe had done this previously, so it was for the first time. In his commentary, Richard takes his readers through the envisioned temple complex carefully, starting with a very general sense of the entire layout, allowing us to situate ourselves properly. So Richard tried to give a context of where we are staying in the three-dimensional plane. Then he zooms into focus on one building in particular, the gatehouses that combine the three atria that surround the temple. He provides three plans and two elevations for the gatehouses on three sides of the complex. The three bird's eye plans show in its general layout a detailed rendering of the half of the building, then its complete internal footprint. The final plan shows a vestibule or the hall running through the middle with long rectangular rooms perpendicular to it. If we set this plan alongside the elevation of the building, we can see these same rooms perched upon each step of the vestibule. To aid readers, Richard labeled the rooms in Latin, making it easy to work from one drawing to another. So, Richard tried to label so that people could understand it in a better manner. We can take the complexity a little further, since in the elevation the viewer can see the interior of the ground floor as if drawing were a section where part of the building is cut open. So Richard tried to demonstrate what the building was using a cross sectional techniques probably. This would make it first clear sectional elevation, okay, and an important development in architectural drawing. So it was a huge or a very important step in architectural drawing. None of Richard's innovations are accidental. Rather, they are rooted in the language of geometry. By including the elevation, the viewer sees that the gatehouses are located on the mountainside. Yet, having to reconcile or re-establish the plan with the elevation disturbed Richard's attempt at accuracy. Okay, he knew that measurements taken along a flat surface and on a sloped one would be different when compared with one another, and result in discrepancies or inconsistencies between his plans and elevation. To combat the problem or to fight with the problem, Richard proposed a method by which a plan measurement could be translated into one that accommodated the mountain slope. Okay, so Richard tried to also incorporate the mountain slope into the 2D drawing itself, using something very similar to a Pythagorean theorem which was then circulating around Western Europe. These plans include measurements that assume the site was flat, and so he calls them planum. And this is the first time this term was used in reference to a drawing. For Richard, a plan was a two-dimensional drawing that showed a layout of a building on a plane surface, language that is still used today. So, Richard coined the term plan, which actually meant that depicting a 3D object into a 2D plane. A number of tantalizing plans predating Richard's commentary survive, but they lack a systematic approach to representing reality. The best known is the 9th century Saint Gall plan. This shows a monastery laid out in Reading, complete with church, cloister, abbot's house, medicinal garden, etc. Everything else a monastery could need, right down to the number of beds in the dormitory. Okay. The note attached to the plan refers to it as an exemplata, a word that could mean anything from copy to proof or a blueprint. The Saint Gall plan likely survived because a couple of centuries later someone wrote a life of Saint Martin on its reverse side. So on the other side, the spiritual text or the life of Saint Martin was written. That's why it survived, which for a medieval audience held more value than its diagram. Okay, for the ancient audience, it was more valuable than the diagram itself. The St. Gall plan is impressive, but it's not entirely clear what any of the proposed monastery buildings would look like, since there are no elevations or there are no geometrical descriptions, and it's only one single drawing, unlike Richard's more expansive or more inclusive approach. Okay. There are other theological plans, images of the celestial Jerusalem, of the Holy Sepulchre, and a couple of others. Their survival suggests that even in the context of so much medieval material that has been lost, there must have been more drawings that were destroyed, else deemed not important enough to save. Not all had the fortune of a life of Saint Martin written on their reverse. Okay, so the author is again trying to continue the fact that people in the ancient era tried to value religious or spiritual text more than that of architecture. So that's why maybe more of those drawings might be lost. Okay. It is tempting to imagine Richard in a conversation with Masons, who must have been a constant presence in Saint Victor. Okay. Richard held the position of prior, sort of second in command in the abbey. Okay, so Richard was not the of the top or the top of the hierarchy. Maybe one of his responsibilities would have been to oversee the masons' work or to carry out the masons' work in the abbey, and to interact with the builders on a regular basis. So he acted as a translator or a boundary or an interface between the builders and the priest or or the people in the church. There was, however, a cultural chasm between the cloister or the people in the church and the building site that Richard would not have crossed lightly, even for the sake of an important work such as a biblical commentary. To do that, I think he crossed another type of boundary. Okay, Saint Victor was famous by the end of 12th century, and one of the reasons why is how good his literal commentaries on Bible were. Okay, so Saint Victor was quite popular probably, an approach advocated by its earliest superstar and Richard's mentor, Hug of Saint Victor. Okay, though Hug was a teacher writer very much in the 12th century Renaissance man. Okay, he is known to have spoken to nearby rabbinic scholars and their schools. Hug recognized the value of Jewish knowledge. So Hug appreciated Jewish knowledge, especially when it came to understanding history. As one modern author put it, from a Christian perspective, talking to a Jewish scholar was like picking up the phone to the Old Testament. Okay, so quite appreciable. Richard, it seems, continued that tradition. So Richard also carried out what his teacher used to do. As if to underline the connection between the two traditions, one of the earliest Christian manuscripts containing Richard's work includes a map of Holy Land described in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 48. It shows the land belonging to the tribes of Israel on the left and right, with the holy city and its environs below. The map is almost identical to one in Hebrew commentary by the famous scholar Rashi, who established his school not far from Paris. The only difference between the Hebrew and Latin maps is the language of the labels. Not long after Richard wrote his commentary, the Jewish scholar Maimonides included architectural drawings in his discussion on the Second Temple, called the Tractate Midot. Okay, not just plans but elevations and even sections, just as in Richard's commentary. So there was a similar type of a book or commentary written like Richard. All these architectural drawings appearing in the theological text of the 12th century does not prove that drawings were used in construction process. What it does prove, though, is that people such as Richard and many readers of his work could understand the language of architectural drawings if a master mason put in front of them. So the author is trying to say that if Richard's work or a similar type of work was uh, appreciated or promoted, then people would have been interested in it. Okay, so I think that makes up for it. In response to my own question as to how some of the great architectural monuments of the medieval Europe could be built without drawings, the answer is they could not. Although we don't have those drawings made by 12th century master masons, Richard's commentary certainly suggests that the practice of architectural drawing was common enough across the religious divide. And if a patron such as Richard could speak that visual language, then so could the people he hired to build Saint Victor. Okay, so the author is suggesting that back in those medieval era or the era of religious divide, people used architectural drawings. They were present, but they were not preserved enough. Richard's importance is clear, but since he was a theologian working in a cloistered community or a community where the influence of church was present, his legacy within architectural history is difficult to quantify. He never built anything as far as we know. I do not want to suggest that the invention of architectural drawing was a top down affair, where the language and visual forms were invented by a patron within theological context and imparted to the lowly builder. So the author is not trying to say that there was a hierarchical factor about or a religious factor about patrons and builders. I do not even want to suggest that the parallel traditions in Islamic countries and further eastern China lag behind the West. Only that the practice as we know it in the West developed out of complex relationship between the patron and mason. So the author is also not trying to glorify the West and almost certainly predates the 13th century. Richard's commentary helps us fill the gaps. It demonstrates how known unknowns become known. Okay, masons and later architects use and develop these drawings to a remarkable degree. Perhaps not based on direct knowledge of Richard's commentary, but certainly from the world that those drawings inhabited. So the final thought of the passage would be the passage revolves around the history of architectural drawings and how Richard played a role in it, how Richard filled the gap between the knowledge and he made something non-existential tangible. So that's about the passage and see you in the next one.